The line moved like a wounded animal. Jerk, pause, shudder. Tomas Tom Salazar of the 200th Coast Artillery, AA, watched a ladle rise from a 55-gallon drum and fall into his dented mess tin. Steam lifted a smell like rice left in a hot car. The grains were grey, some broken to flour, freckled with grit and weevils that writhed in the heat without dying. A fly landed on the rim and stayed. April on Bataan is the furnace month. Yesterday the guns had fallen silent. Today the new weapons were heat, distance, and a ration that looked back at you. He knew the date because the man behind him, one of the New Mexico Guard, whispered it like a curse. April 10th, the morning after surrender. Bayonets winked when the sun found a gap in the canopy. A truck coughed somewhere. Closer, canteens clinked as the column shuffled north. Tom knew the language of machines, the clean snap of a breech block, the solvent sweet smell of oiled parts, yet those were yesterday's verbs. Today spoke in calories. A march, he discovered, is only music if there is water at the end of it. He raised the tin and tasted what he had been given. The first mouthful was starchy and faintly sweet. The second carried sand across his teeth. A Filipino corporal ahead skimmed weevils from his serving, then stirred them back in. "Protein," the man said. Tom swallowed. His body did the math, knees humming, hands unsteady, a hollowness moving into bone. He could not have named a figure, but the ration was south of enough. Later he would call it roughly 1,000 calories, falling. In that moment he called it not nearly. The guard at the drum wore an arisaka, and the face of a clerk paid to say no. He did not sneer. Scarcity did his work for him. The trail kinked toward Camp O'Donnell, a place Tom had not seen and already feared. Men spoke in undertones about malaria, about shoes, about how many belt holes they had left. Tom cinched his own to a new notch, leather creaking like a warning. He had been a mechanic. He knew how small tolerances rule outcomes. A fan belt too loose makes heat. A ration too thin turns men into arithmetic. He thought of the guns, the 3-inch pieces they had served when the sky over Olongapo filled with bombers. The breech had felt honest in his hand. You could fix a jam. You could not fix a shortage by will. Humidity made the spoon slippery. He wiped it on his sleeve and ate slower, discovering he could stretch 30 mouthfuls across the length of a prayer. A man fell behind him without a sound, and the tin rang on coral like a small bell. No one turned. Momentum did the thinking now. The jungle was not cruel, it was indifferent. The only rhythms were footfalls, the clink of mess gear, the occasional barked order in a language most did not share. Tom understood one thing perfectly. The war had inverted. Yesterday he fought with steel and recoil. Today he would fight with what was left of his body. He blew across the rice to cool it, watched the weevils make tiny wakes, and kept eating. Later he would remember the fly more than the guard, the fly that would not lift, because it proved heat could break men without troubling a bug. At the head of the column a tune started, a fragment of a marching song sung low so the guards would ignore it. Tom did not join. He was busy counting, measuring, bargaining with himself. He found the 10th mouthful tasted best, the 20th tasted like paste, the 30th felt like a vote against quitting. He promised himself another belt notch tomorrow if he could steal it from the leather. He promised a swallow of clean water if any appeared. He learned in one tin of rotten rice what months of training had not. Surrender happens in steps, and the first step is hunger. By dusk, the trail would reach wire and barracks and a name that would live like a fever in memory. For now there was the tin, the heat, the hunger, the arithmetic. He licked the last starch from the rim and dipped the cup in a bucket that used to hold kerosene. The water tasted like rust. He swallowed anyway. The line jerked, paused, and shuddered forward. Someone whispered that April was the hottest month. Someone else said tomorrow would be worse. Tom tucked the empty tin under his arm, fixed his eyes on the back ahead, and stepped into the new war, the war measured in mouthfuls. April 10th, 1942. Chicago and Washington, 1942. The teleprinter rattled like small arms fire in the quartermaster office while Captain Ruth Holcomb pinned a sheet above the rail map. Article 11, 1929 Geneva Convention, black letters under a brass tack. Prisoners shall receive food equal in quantity and quality to depot troops. She read it again, not because she doubted the words, but because of what they required. Law is not a speech. Law is a schedule. She drew a line from the Union stockyards to a cold storage plant, from there to a rail junction, and from there to a camp kitchen she had never seen. A pencil can move more tonnage than a truck if the line is straight enough. She had been a dietitian before the war and knew how numbers become muscle. Depot troops ate garrison rations that ran to 3,000 calories, meat, bread, potatoes, vegetables, coffee, and they ate them on time. Equal, the article said. So German prisoners would eat meat in America because Americans said so on paper and were the sort who turned paper into trains. She checked the reefer schedule. Temperature must hold 34 to 38 degrees. Each car carried carcasses hung from overhead rails, weight logged to the pound. The figures looked cool even in July. The phone rang. Washington wanted throughput, not poetry. Head counts by camp, menu cycles, inspection intervals. Ruth read back numbers, the cadence flat and sure. She could see the loop as if she rode inside it. Cattle on the hoof, hooks creaking, meat moving into the chill, ledger lines signed by hands that smelled of soap and blood. She added bread units, dried beans, greens when available, milk when the route allowed. Not charity, policy, reciprocity if captured, credibility if judged. A nation keeps promises at scale, or it does not keep them at all. The first inspection run took her south by night train. At Memphis, she walked the platform beside a refrigerator car and cracked the door. Cold rolled out like strategy. Inside, carcasses swung gently with the settling train, every hook tagged, every pound accounted. She followed the train to a camp she would write 100 times on forms and hardly remember on maps. The mess sergeant met her under a bare bulb and showed shelves of flour, tubs of lard, bins of potatoes, sacks of onions, crates stamped with inspection seals. Turkey was chalked for Thursday. She checked the weights and the head count and found them married. She walked the line at noon. Stainless pans steamed, coffee urns hissed. A POW stepped forward, tray out. The server's ladle made the same heavy sound for this man as for the next and the next. Article 11 hung in the kitchen like a second clock. Ruth did not make speeches. She made standards. She signed where the form asked and told the sergeant she would be back unannounced. On the train north, she slept with her hat over her eyes and dreamed in portion weights. Back in Chicago, a colonel asked why men who had fought under Rommel should eat U.S. beef. Because they are prisoners, and we are Americans, she said, and because reciprocity is not a rumour. He muttered about ration books. She slid a sheet across the desk that showed output lines climbing like stairways. The United States could meet depot standards for its own, ship combat rations across oceans, and still feed enemy prisoners on menus with meat and vegetables. He studied the sheet a long time and then signed the requisition. Numbers did what sermons could not. Ruth wrote a memo that felt like a thesis. Feeding prisoners requires temperature control, routing precision measured in hours, and auditors who can smell a false entry. It requires cooks who know the difference between a ladle that cheats and one that doesn't. It requires inspectors willing to walk storerooms at night and ask why a potato bin runs low on a Tuesday. It requires a nation willing to make law the first item on any menu. She ended the day under the map with a pencil. Reefer car numbers became an arrow of chalk, then a train in her mind, then a hot plate lifted from a steam table in a camp far away. It was work, and work done right prevents uglier work. Somewhere a prisoner would lift a fork and be surprised that the food was good. Somewhere a guard would quote a regulation instead of an opinion. And somewhere, in a jungle whose name she did not yet know, an American would count mouthfuls and imagine a different arithmetic. Ruth sharpened her pencil and made the line straighter. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, June 2nd, 1943. Heat met the train like a living thing, green and wet and loud with insects. Gefreiter Karl Weber stepped down in boots still dusted with North Africa and stared at a sign he could not read until a guard translated Aliceville. He braced for curses or a rifle butt because that was what a captured man expected. Instead, a lieutenant checked a clipboard, nodded, and said in slow German there would be chow after processing. The word hung absurdly in the air, chow. They marched through a gate between towers and wire to a compound so clean it felt like a stage. Barracks in rows, gravel raked, a baseball diamond chalked bright. The mess hall doors stood open, a wet heat pouring out, and with it a smell that hit Karl in the knees, meat and yeast and coffee. Inside, the line moved with a factory's rhythm. Trays slid, ladles rose and fell. The first scoop landed on his steel, a slice of meatloaf dense as a fist, gravy pooling beside potatoes and green beans, bread cut square, a pat of butter, coffee that steamed like breath. Across the room, a blackboard announced the week. Monday stew, Tuesday chops, Thursday turkey if supply. Holiday menus would be posted near the date. A sergeant with forearms like bridge timbers watched the servers and said nothing, which told Karl that standards were being kept. Men from his company kept glancing up, then down, then back to their trays, and a small shame flickered at the corners of their mouths, the shame of relief. The guard who had marched them in now stood by the urn and quoted the rule, equal to depot troops. An older guard collected belts and knives and told them the rest. Work details to farms or canneries would begin once the doctors cleared them. Pay tokens could be spent at the canteen for items chalked on a board, soap, stationery, tobacco, sometimes chocolate when the truck made it through. Letters were allowed within limits. Discipline was strict. Escape would be punished, but meals were meals and would arrive on time. Article 11 rode inside that promise like a hidden engine. Karl ate cautiously at first, then faster. The gravy had pepper. The bread tore like clouds. He tried to imagine the chain that brought this food to his tray, and the image kept lengthening. Stockyards to cold storage, refrigerator cars held at 30-something degrees, inspectors' clipboards, a mess sergeant's chalk. He could not know the grand totals, but men on kitchen duty whispered figures that sounded like fairy tales. By wartime tallies, the United States produced over 40 billion pounds of meat in a single year, roughly 100+ million pounds every day. To a man who had watched whole units go thin, the number felt impossible. One day's American output could have granted a half-pound serving to every POW in the country with rail cars still rolling. He held the fork and felt ideology loosen its grip. In the morning, the doctor tapped his chest, peered at his gums, and stamped his card. Fit for labour. A truck took his detail past porches where women waved as if a convoy had gone by. On the farm, the air smelled of cut alfalfa and diesel, and the foreman spoke German learned from parents who had come to Alabama before the last war. Rows of men moved behind balers and tractors whose brand names meant nothing to Karl, yet their confidence did. At noon, the lunch pails held sandwiches thick with meat and a wedge of apple, and the foreman offered seconds without ceremony. Pride said no, curiosity said yes, the body voted yes again. That evening, the canteen sold soap and paper and a few precious envelopes. Karl bought a pencil and sat on his bunk under a ceiling fan that turned like a patient propeller. He began a letter he did not know would be censored and wrote a plain truth: the food is good. He did not add that it was better than any meal he had eaten in the desert, or that it arrived with the regularity of a metronome. He did not know how to explain that rules, when kept, can feed men as decisively as guns can kill them. Lights Out came with the clack of a breaker. Somewhere a radio pulled in a dance tune from Birmingham. A voice down the row said if this was a cage, it was built of rules and roast beef. Carl did not answer. Order, he thought, was a kind of mercy. In the morning the chalkboard would still be there, the inspector's pencil would still be sharp, the train beyond the wire would still hum. He would line up again and take his tray and understand a little more about the people who had captured him. The gate had closed behind him, but something in his mind had opened. The Cold Chain, 1943 to 1944. The platform crew rolled a refrigerator car under the depot lights, steel gleaming like a surgical instrument. Captain Ruth Holcomb climbed the step iron and cracked the door. Cold air slid out over her boots and pooled around the rails. Inside, carcasses swung gently from overhead hooks, each tagged, each pound recorded in a hand that would be audited. She checked the thermometer, 36, and signed the line. Temperature is policy made visible. The car clanked into a train that would thread river towns and pine belts before dawn. Law travelled inside those riveted walls. The schedule said Memphis at midnight, Meridian at 3, Aliceville before mess call. She had memorized the block signal cadence the way an artilleryman learns his fuse settings. A delay is a ration lost. On paper, the loop was simple. Stockyard, chill, rail, kitchen, tray. In motion it was 1,000 hands hitting their marks so cleanly the prisoner at the end never saw the choreography. Head counts drove drawers, drawers drove menus, menus drove orders, orders drove slaughter. She visited a camp where a mess sergeant had stacked flour too close to a damp wall. She asked for a pallet and saw it appear before she finished her inspection route. She tasted coffee from an urn and sent the pot back for the full measure of grounds. She lifted a ladle and listened to the sound it made falling into a tray, heavy, even, unhurried. Article 11 hung on the kitchen wall without commentary, as plain as a clock. A young private asked why it mattered if the meat was fresh when the men behind the wire were enemies. "Because a standard is a weapon," Ruth said. "We use it to prove who we are and to make reciprocity more than a wish." He nodded, half convinced, then fully so when she showed him the inspection log signed by 2 colonels and a visiting Swiss delegate. The United States kept ledgers the way an arsenal keeps ammunition, dry, sorted, within reach. She rode another train west toward a depot in Louisiana where citrus piled like ammunition and greens came in by the crate. On the siding, 2 more refrigerator cars idled, numbers chalked in a clerk's neat hand. She could tell at a glance which were loaded out of Chicago and which out of Fort Worth by the packing slips and the smell of the fat. She marked a route change to avoid a washed-out trestle and scratched the update onto 3 copies. By evening, mess stewards along the line would adjust their menus 2 ounces here, 3 ounces there, without a single plate going light. At night, in a Pullman berth, she read a memo that compared depot standard calories to field rations at the front and to the measured allowances for prisoners. The ratios told a story without adjectives, a system that could feed combat divisions across oceans and still provide regular meat to men who had fought against it. She slept, woke to the brake hiss, and started again. In one kitchen, a POW stepped forward and, in careful English, asked if he might thank the cook for the bread. The sergeant blinked, then nodded, and the kitchen went on steaming, as if nothing remarkable had happened. In another camp, a corporal showed Ruth a crate of onions that had sprouted. She tapped the slats and asked for a sunlit storage corner. The next day, the sprouts were gone, and the ledger entry moved forward 12 pounds, reclaimed. Every correction was a small victory. The war made heroes of men with shovels and rifles. It also required women with clipboards and a habit of straight lines. She finished a month's rotation and brought her pencil back to the wall map in Chicago. Reefer numbers became chalk, chalk became trains, trains became trays, trays became quiet astonishment when a prisoner discovered Thursday truly meant turkey. She folded her inspection notes, wrote 2 reprimands and 4 commendations, and sent a wire to Washington that was nothing but numbers. A Standard had travelled 1,000 miles and kept its shape. Manila, 1942 to 1944. The fan turned the hot air without cooling it, a slow paddle in a brown river. Sergeant Clark Ishikawa stood at a ledger and subtracted again. Requests from camps exceeded allocations. Ships did not arrive. Sacks of rice went musty on a pier for lack of drayage. Monsoon water found every crack. He had been told to balance the page. He could not balance a hunger. Japan had never ratified the 1929 convention. The guidance from above spoke of humanitarian considerations, but not of obligations, and the numbers on his desk obeyed no law except shortage. The 14th Army's needs came first: ammunition, fuel, labour. The column marked prisoners had no advocate but a clerk with an ink-stained thumb. Ishikawa dipped his brush and wrote smaller, trying to make food by making space, and stared at a figure that would not divide. An officer from the logistics section, face gaunt from his own ration, asked how many koku remained at the depot. Ishikawa gave the number and the caveats. Some sacks spoiled, some pledged forward, some pledged twice. The officer frowned, thanked him, and walked out into the heat that made paper soft. Reports from the camps used euphemisms he had learned to translate. Complaints of sickness meant dysentery and beriberi. Losses overnight meant men who had lain down and could not get up again. Adequate meant not enough. Calorie figures were estimates at best, but the trend line, if drawn, would have sagged below the body's needs, toward 700 or 1,000 on good days, toward watery, nothing on bad. He had been a schoolteacher once and loved neat columns. He had learned here that some sums produce silence. Ships went out marked with bold characters and did not return. American bombers rebuilt the harbour out of splinters and flame, and the rail line into the hills lost 3 bridges in 2 months. Ishikawa received an instruction to move prisoners north for labour. He wrote the transport order. The men were packed into holds of an unmarked vessel. A week later, rumours drifted back like smoke through a vent. Suffocation, heat, disease, attack from the air because the ship carried no sign. He entered nothing under remarks. A ledger cannot forgive. He signed another denial. The camp commandant's pleading note, "Your honourable consideration, must have rice," lay under his blotter like a weight. He smiled politely at a captain who joked about weevils and protein. He did not say that men now counted the insects as mercy. In the evenings, after the office shut, he walked past a warehouse where rice was stacked to the roof and could not be moved because the trucks had no tyres. The smell was sweet and wrong. He put his hand against the sacks and felt the heat of hidden life. If the empire could not feed captives, what could it claim to rule? He did not say that out loud. He wrote another memorandum about transport priorities and used the honorifics that made refusal sound like courtesy. When the rains came hard, the roof leaked in 3 places, and the ledger swelled and wrinkled, and a month's careful lines went blurred. He copied what he could into a fresh book and threw the ruined pages into a stove that did not heat the room. Men of higher rank spoke of spirit and of the shame of surrender. Ishikawa believed in spirit. He also believed in inventories. A culture that treats capture as a stain leaves captives without a lobby. He sharpened his pencil with a penknife and drew a small box at the end of the table and wrote the character for 0 to make the fact official. Outside, tyres splashed through a puddle that would be a crater by autumn. He closed the ledger and tied it with twine and set it on a high shelf as if height might preserve hope. The fan clicked, paused, and resumed. He sat down and sharpened another pencil. O'Donnell and Aliceville, 1943 to 1944. At dawn in Luzon, the line to the cook fire bent like a reed fence. Tom Salazar held his tin with both hands to steady the tremor and waited for the ladle. the grey skin on the rice sealing and peeling with each stir. The guard with the slung arisaka stared past him, bored and sunburnt, a civil servant of hunger. When the tin filled, Tom blew across the surface and watched the weevils cut wakes, then ate without ceremony. He had learned to make 30 mouthfuls last a prayer and a half. He had learned that belt leather stretches if you insist. He had learned that a man can walk on the promise of water longer than he would have guessed. In Alabama, under a roof that rang in summer rain, Carl Weber slid his tray along a stainless rail and watched potatoes fall in a soft thud, then green beans, then a slice of meatloaf under a spoon of gravy. The mess sergeant's eyes never left the ladles. A posted menu promised turkey on Thursday if supply. The chalk had the confident stroke of a man who trusted trains. Article 11 lived on the wall as a sentence and in the kitchen as a habit. The two lines existed at the same hour, divided by oceans and doctrine. Tom's ration would have been south of 1,000 calories on a good day. Carl's would track the depot standard, scaled but regular, anchored in meat and bread and coffee. In Luzon, the air tasted of tin and heat. In Alabama, it tasted of yeast and pepper. Tom's line smelled of smoke and mildew. Carl's smelled of soap and onions. On a Sunday in Aliceville, a chaplain said grace and the dining room answered in English and German. On a Sunday in O'Donnell, men answered nothing because saving breath became policy. In Chicago, Ruth Holcomb laid two ledgers side by side, one a composite of camp audits, the other a brief of Pacific reports. She did not pretend the pages matched. She used them to explain a fact that would have sounded like boasting if it were not typed in numbers. The United States could feed hundreds of thousands of captive enemies on a diet that included regular meat while provisioning multi-theatre armies abroad. A single modest refrigerator train, 20 cars loaded to safe weights, could carry enough beef in a night's run to serve a half-pound portion to every POW in the country and still leave leftovers for a depot mess. It was a back-of-the-ledger calculation, but the lesson was sound. The side that controls temperature controls time. The side that controls time decides whether meals arrive. Tom learned new arithmetic anyway. He learned that if you eat slowly enough, your stomach forgets to ask for more until the cup is empty. He learned there are men who will trade a cigarette for 2 mouthfuls, and men who will trade a story for 1. He learned that a tune sung just above a whisper counts as medicine. Carl learned different rules. He learned that you can tell a just system by the way a sergeant watches a ladle. He learned that American coffee tastes like a promise kept. He learned that the word equal, when painted on a rule, can travel farther than a flag. On the farm, he saw alfalfa shaved into bales with mechanical confidence and thought of the tidy rectangles as the visible form of order. Tom stepped off a work detail with his headlight and his temper short and realized everything now ran on a smaller spark. Stand, hold, keep, breathe. Carl walked back from a field with hay chaff in his hair and realized everything in this place ran on a larger clock. Whistle, lunch, mail, lights. Neither man called it strategy, but it was. The days moved, 2 lines advanced, in one a tin, in the other a tray. The ladles rose and fell, heavy or thin, and the war explained itself without a single speech. 1944. The hatch slammed like a lid on a boiling pot and the light went out. Shoulder to shoulder, shin to shin, Tom Salazar felt the hold accept them the way a furnace accepts coal, useful only as heat. Planks sweated, iron sweated, men sweated. A match flared, faces floated like wet stone and vanished. Air thickened to syrup, then to something thinner than prayer. A bucket rattled down on a rope and rattled back up. A man slumped and did not fall because the crush held him upright. Tom lifted his dented tin not for food, but to keep a helmet's width of breathing room around his mouth. He fixed his mind to mechanics, tappets, fuel, spark, because engines obeyed rules and panic did not. Somewhere above, winches clanked and a boatswain barked. In the belly below, hope shrank to the size of a swallow. The chaplain's voice returned from steel like an extra weight on the chest. Someone tried a marching song, coughed blood into the tune, and the tune died. The bucket came back with water tasting of rope and rust. Tom drank, passed it, and counted the pass as a kind of prayer. Across an ocean under yard lights bright as noon, Captain Ruth Holcomb walked a platform where refrigerator cars hummed like obedient engines. Frost rhymed the door gaskets. Seals took her fingerprint clean when she pressed and lifted. 36 degrees held steady on the thermometer she checked and initialed. Temperature is policy made visible, she thought. She ran a finger down the manifest. Hooks loaded, weights logged to the pound, inspection stamps square, and signed her name with a line that meant dinner would arrive on time. A reefer train is a declaration of intent. To keep what spoils, to deliver what melts, to make time obey. Dispatch read her the route windows like fire mission data. Meridian by 3, Jackson by 5, Aliceville before mess call. She marked a small star beside coffee, labour detail. Double measure. If you schedule meat, you schedule morale. If you schedule coffee, you schedule patience. The brakeman chalked a number on steel, and the chalk looked like mercy when you knew where it ended. In the hold, air turned into a drink you could not swallow. Men stripped to shorts that stuck to their backs. Tom let memory trick him. Cottonwoods along the Rio Grande shaking leaves like water, gasoline pinging in his uncle's pump, the honest click of a well-set tappet. He inventoried himself like a motor, knees stable, hands trembling, breath fetched from the seam where plank met hull. A boy he did not know steadied the tin to his lips. Passing the cup became policy. Possession would have been cruelty. When the bucket dropped again, hands lifted it as if it were sacrament and watched the rope as if it were time. Ruth stepped onto the last car and put her palm to a door that breathed cold. She had copied the sentence so often it felt like liturgy. Law is a schedule. In the private margin of a notebook, she once wrote, "Mercy is a schedule too." Article 11, equal to depot troops, hung in her mind like a signal lamp. The country had built steel to make that line true at noon and at midnight. She watched a seal pressed into place over the hasp and saw as plainly as any colonel that exactness could feel like kindness when it arrived as hot food on a tray. Night ground on. Tom mapped the hold by touch. A seam here, a beam there, a knot in plank like a landmark. He dozed 15 breaths, woke to the bucket, drank, and passed the tin to a hand that shook. When air went thin as paper, he found the seam breath again and sipped it. He could not hear the ocean through the men, but he felt the sea in the slow sway that shifted bone against board. Above, boots hammered a run, a hatch clanged, then silence returned, the kind that teaches patience better than any sermon. The reefer eased out with a low steel moan, cold and time moving under Ruth's boots as surely as if she rode a clock. She penciled a note to a mess sergeant. Turkey Thursday confirmed. Gravy by the gallon. The conductor tipped his cap. They would make the board by a nose. Ruth looked at the rail map in her head and saw 2 lines across one world, one pushing heat toward hunger, one pulling cold toward order, and believed, with the quiet faith inspectors earn, that the colder line would win. Thanksgiving and Christmas, 1944. Carl Weber read the chalkboard like a man braced for a trick and found none. Turkey, mashed potatoes, dressing, green beans, rolls, pie. Paper garlands hung between beams. An evergreen leaned into a tub near the door. A corporal with a parade ground voice called the line to order, and trays slid forward with factory rhythm. The first slice landed with a proper weight. Gravy the colour of roast drippings followed, pepper bright in the air. Coffee steamed into tin cups that scalded the hand and warmed the heart. Across the room, a posted note in crisp block letters reminded the staff, Article 11, equal to depot troops, no exceptions. Carl watched the mess sergeant's eyes travel the ladles like a surveyor sighting a boundary. Seconds would be granted if the count allowed it. The rule cut both ways. He felt the old pride stir, then settle. The room smelled of yeast and black coffee and something harder to name. Standards kept. He knew, from farm work and ration books shown by a grinning foreman, that American civilians counted sugar stamps and gasoline coupons. He knew theatre could not hold 36 degrees in a reefer car for 1,000 miles. What he tasted was not charity, it was the taste of schedules kept by people who believed schedules could be sacred. He ate slowly, measuring the difference between suspicion and gratitude. At his table a guard said in careful German, "Guten Appetit," and passed the salt as if passing a treaty. After lunch, with the kitchen swallowed by the noise of washing, the camp turned into a county fair. A soccer match roared on one field and a baseball game on another. Carl took right field and learned to run for a ball that curved in the air instead of along the ground. He chased a fly, caught it, and tasted winter in his lungs. On the sideline, a private traded jokes in broken phrases about who ruined more gloves this season. At the canteen, a short run of chocolate, arrived like contraband, logged like treasure, vanished in minutes to a chorus of coins. The clerk joked that Christmas had come early, then stamped the ledger with a seriousness that said he knew what he held. Ruth Holcomb walked behind the steam tables with a clipboard and a smile she kept small because pride belongs first to cooks. She checked portion weights, lifted lids, tasted salt, and asked for a second urn of coffee because one would not do for men far from home. The mess sergeant, who had cooked for a National Guard armory before fate promoted him to history, moved with the grace of a short-order magician. "Standards are standards," he said, not looking up, and Ruth nodded because the words were better than a speech. Evening brought songs in English and German, harmonies soft enough to pass the wire. The chaplain read a passage about mercy that named no enemy and left none out. Carl sat under a rafter glossed with decades of hand oil and thought of his mother's kitchen in Hesse, of a sink window fogged by bread coming out of the oven. He thought of the farm wife in Alabama who slipped an extra sandwich into his pail with the offhandedness of someone raised to abundance. He traced the seam where gratitude meets shame and decided to call the seam truth. Lights went out, rain ticked the roof, and the room sighed itself to sleep. Carl lay awake and composed the letter he had drafted in his head since summer. "The food is excellent," he would write. "We work hard, we eat well, we are watched but not tormented, and the rules are rules for everyone." He would not add that he had seen an American corporal deny seconds to his own because the count would not allow it. Some details were better as lessons than lines. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind work the eaves. Beyond the wire, trains moved, ships sailed, men bled. He did not mistake the meal for peace. He did understand that a nation confident enough to feed enemies meat on a holiday believed itself strong enough to be merciful, and that such belief made routine was a weapon of its own. Early 1945. The conference room smelled of chalk and pencil shavings, the safe scent of problems that can be solved. Ruth Holcomb faced a board split down the middle. On the left, totals the quartermaster had compiled, Axis prisoners in US custody, fed daily on menus scaled from depot standards, refrigerator car miles, inspection counts, temperature logs with invariants, holiday menus posted and kept. On the right, fragments gathered from Pacific reports, rations cut towards sub-maintenance, water lines that ended in dust, weight loss recorded as a column of dashes. Numbers do not argue, they only add. A colonel tapped the left column and asked if it was a boast. Ruth said it was a ledger. She underlined the line that always sounded like hyperbole until you did the math. At wartime peak, one day of American meatpacking, north of £100 million, could have issued a half-pound portion to every POW in the country and still fed garrison messes with surplus. Not policy, she said, capacity. A refrigerator train of 20 cars, properly loaded and routed, would deliver enough beef in one night to supply every major POW camp on its division and leave a cushion for breakdowns. Not a parade, a schedule. She wrote carefully where records ran thin, likely typical based on inspection series, and refused the temptation to bless the board with adjectives. Refrigerator cars held 34 to 38 degrees because seals were checked, because men signed for locks, because doors opened only on time. Bread met meat because mills slaved shifts to rail clocks. Coffee arrived because the United States could push beans and boilers in a cadence no empire built on whim could match. Audit lines read like drill cards, storerooms dry, bins off the floor, onions turned to sun when they sprout. The harder the rule, the kinder the outcome at the tray. The colonel asked about waste, and Ruth nodded. Waste was the shadow of speed, but even waste, measured and learned from, beat starvation repeated as policy. She flipped a page and showed curves no one wished to see and everyone needed to face. Mortality in Pacific camps against mortality in US custody. "We do not print this to wound," she said. "We print it because truth recruits allies. Men fight better under standards than slogans." She pointed to a short note about a mess sergeant refusing to serve meat from 3 cars with broken seals and receiving replacements before noon. A rule had travelled 1,000 miles and kept its shape. When the meeting broke, she carried her notes to the typing pool. The memo that left her desk spoke plain. Article 11 remains operative. Tie menus to daily headcount. Inspect cold storage by thermometer, not rumour. Treat temperature like a treaty. Invite neutral eyes and publish their signatures. Teach mess sergeants to hear the difference between a ladle that cheats and one that fills. The colonel returned the paper with a penciled line at the bottom. "This is not a boast. It is doctrine." Ruth folded the sheet and imagined it crossing desks and oceans the way rations did, gravity on its side. Numbers had made a shape around mercy. The arithmetic of victory cared less who read it than who kept it. Somewhere a prison kitchen would post Thursday's turkey and serve it. Somewhere a line on the other column would shorten because parachutes opened on time. Somewhere a clerk would learn that equal in quantity and quality is not rhetoric. It is a train that arrives when the clock says it will. Spring and summer, 1945. The gate looked smaller because his eyes had learned to hoard distance. When it opened, noise arrived like weather. A run of boots, a shout in a voice that did not belong to guards, the rattle of a truck whose engine sang like a hymn. Men did not cheer. They went quiet the way a fever breaks. Medics moved in a line that would have looked like mercy even if you did not know their names. They set a table under a tree and made a hospital out of shade. Thermometers flashed, clipboards wrote, hands gentled ribs. Tom Salazar stared at a crust of bread and did what he had promised himself he would not do. He cried. A medic broke the piece smaller with the care of a watchmaker. "Easy, soldier," he said. "We'll bring you home the long way." Refeeding is a hard science. Kindness has to pace itself. Tom nodded because nodding was the cheapest movement. He swallowed milk in a spoon, felt it move through him like heat from a fire first lit. He wanted another and waited because waiting was the new rule. Crates landed, knives nicked pine, and the air filled with a smell that ran straight to childhood. Chocolate, sweet and unearned. Cans of meat, tins of jam, powdered eggs, flour in sacks that would later become aprons. Everything moved across the table in measures that felt small until you remembered the numbers behind them. Liquids first, then soft solids, then careful protein, then normal that would feel like a parade. Tom's hands shook and did not spill. The medic's script had been rehearsed as precisely as drill. The chaplain spoke words that asked nothing but assent. He named the men who could not answer to their names and built a brief service out of gratitude and policy. "God's mercy often looks like logistics," he said, and nobody laughed because the sentence told the truth. Tom closed his eyes and let numbers move through him as warmth. Calories staged and stepped, hours measured, rest enforced by orderlies who had learned to be stubborn about life. In the afternoon, parachutes opened with the lazy dignity of peonies, and the field received them like a promise kept. The silk looked indecently bright against worn earth. Someone said it aloud, sounding surprised by his own voice. They thought of everything. Tom believed it because a private with a thermometer had remembered to touch his wrist and say, I know, like a brother, before taking it away. He walked a little the next day and found the fence looked climbable, not mythic. The medics moved him along the gradient they knew by heart. More broth, a slice of buttered bread, a few bites of meat, rest, measure, repeat. The difficult part of mercy is patience. Tom learned patience. He relearned the weight of a spoon, then a fork, then a plan. He made a vow to memorize every hand that steadied him, and to make of the memory not an anchor, but a compass. When the convoy rolled, home did not feel like escape so much as transfer between lines on a ledger. A medic climbed in and read the schedule for the day. When to drink, when to sleep, when to eat again. Men obeyed gladly because obedience finally brought comfort. A tin of peaches flashed open in the corner, sun hidden in syrup. Tom shelled a soft slice into his mouth and felt the sugar argue gently with years of subtraction. He could not have named doctrine, but he knew the thing carrying him was a system that believed standards are how a free people love strangers. He closed his eyes and let the truck's springs teach his bones a new rhythm. Late 1945 to 1946, Karl Weber stood on a dock under a sky the colour of tin and watched the gangway flex as men filed aboard. The war had been over for months, but departures always feel like beginnings wearing old clothes. His suitcase did not belong to him, his letter did. The food was excellent, it said. We were watched closely, but the rules were rules for everyone. I learned a game with a bat that curves the ball and a word, fair, that means more here than anywhere I have seen. He folded the paper and placed it beside a loaf the cook had slipped him at dawn. On the ship he found a place by the rail and watched the port fold to toy size. The line became a rope, the rope a thread, the thread a wake that flattened and was gone. An American private leaned a duffel against paint and asked, "Where you from, friend?" They compared Winters and Mother's soups the way men learn they share an uncle. The private had loaded reefer cars after a Niemet Italy. He said the cars hummed like good machines, and he had never felt more useful than the day the thermometer held true from yard to yard. Kindness can be freight, he said, and Carl filed the phrase beside other truths. In Chicago, Ruth Holcomb boxed inspection files with the bored tenderness of a nurse packing a kit. One more memorandum wanted writing, and she wrote it. The wartime cold chain could be turned toward peace. The cars that carried beef could carry milk and penicillin. The inspection routine could inoculate cities against rot and rumour, publish standards, audit anyway, invite neutral eyes. She sent it up with no adjectives and found, to her private satisfaction, that the new colonel signed without edits. Doctrine had outlived uniforms. Tom Salazar came home lighter in weight and older in the eyes. The kitchen smelled larger than the house. A loaf cooled on a towel. He did not touch it until the hand he loved placed a slice in his palm. He ate slowly, like a man undoing a knot. When he slept, the dreams did not always return to the hold. Sometimes they moved to a future aisle of cold shining like a church, doors of glass, bright labels, the sound of compressors like lullabies written by engineers. He could not say why the vision comforted him except that order had begun to feel like safety. News travelled backward and outward on paper and in voices. In Germany, Karl's letters about coffee by the urn and meat by the slice disturbed men who had believed uniforms louder than facts. In the Philippines, Tom's testimony became an affidavit, and the clerk who typed his sentence about weevils did not change a word. In stateside classrooms, excerpts from Ruth's audits taught young officers to hear the moral in a schedule. Factories that had spun ammunition began canning peaches with a precision that felt like a salute. Reefer cars hauled oranges north against winter. Ruth rode 2 more inspections for old time's sake and caught a young sergeant shading a weight. "Standards are how we love strangers," she said, and the kid repeated it back like a cadence he meant to remember. Carl's ship found fog and then harbour. Cranes stood like iron birds at roost. He shouldered the suitcase and stepped into a country that had not yet decided where to put men like him. He found work at a bakery because butter is a language without borders. Tom found a garage because engines tell the truth. Starve them, they stop. Ruth discovered that peace, like war, fails first at temperature if neglected. Each carried away a sentence shaped by numbers. Keep the promise on time. Tom Salazar stood before a supermarket case that hummed like a good engine and tried to understand that a single aisle could defeat despair. Glass held back a weather he could control with his hand. Beef lay in neat red ranks, chicken glowed pale gold, milk stood at attention in white. He lifted a roast wrapped in paper, felt the honest weight, and thought, absurdly yet precisely, of the seam in a ship where he had learned to draft air. A child tugged a sleeve and asked for the cereal with the cowboy. The mother laughed and did arithmetic with coupons. The line moved without a guard. He knew now his memories lived inside larger numbers. The United States at peak could turn out meat by the £100 million in 24 hours, bread by miles of loaves, coffee by rivers, impossible quantities made ordinary by schedules. Inspectors could check seals from Memphis to Meridian to Aliceville before lunch because trains obeyed clocks and men obeyed standards. German prisoners had eaten according to rules posted in kitchens and enforced with clipboards, not moods. In the Pacific, Americans had survived on rotten rice and stubbornness until parachutes blossomed on time. Capacity and conscience had not been speeches, they had been work. Carl Weber, baker now, weighed flour on a scale he kept honest and slid loaves onto a bench rubbed smooth by a century of hands. He brewed coffee on Thursdays because a small sign in the window had once brought back the faces of men who had learned to be fair to strangers. Sometimes he closed the shop early, stood in the doorway, and watched children argue over baseball cards as if rule and luck could live in the same pocket. On a back wall, where only he could see it, hung a photograph of a mess hall chalkboard. Thursday. Turkey, if supply. He smiled whenever deliveries arrived on time. Ruth Holcomb retired and framed a single page from a wartime memo, the line that had made a colonel scribble, "This is doctrine," in the margin. It was the back of the ledger calculation. One day's wartime meatpacking could have issued a half-pound portion to every POW in America, with rations left for garrison mess. She kept the page not as a banner, but as proof that abundance disciplined by law embarrasses cruelty every time. When the compressor in her icebox kicked on, she heard a distant reefer car finding 36 degrees and felt history click into place. The world learned the lesson at different speeds. Some nations adopted standards that travelled with cargo, others paid in spoilage and rumour. The United States exported grain and milk, and the idea that a posted menu is a kind of flag. Factories automated, reefer units learned new tricks, clipboards turned into gauges, the doctrine stayed true. A free people can turn compassion into throughput if they choose punctuality as virtue. Tom believed that with the sincerity of a man who had been hungry. He had no use for speeches, he had a use for schedules. If asked, he would have said, "A nation proves itself when it feeds enemies on holidays and saves its own with teaspoons." Cruelty is cheap at first and ruinous later. Mercy seems costly until you add what it buys. He would have pointed to the cold case, to the roast in his hand, to the children asking for more, and said there, "This is how you win a century. You promise, you count, you deliver." He spoke softly because his voice still remembered the hold. On the way out, he paused at a bulletin board where a hand-lettered card offered thanks to veterans with a Thursday discount. He smiled without irony. The air in the loading bay smelled of oranges as a truck backed to the dock and a compressor coughed itself awake. The rhythm sounded like a lullaby written by engineers. He went home with the paper-wrapped weight under his arm and set the oven to a number he trusted. Behind him the door sighed shut, the case kept humming, and the nation kept time.